There is a lot of non-bank capital looking to find opportunity. In fact, there's probably more capital in non-bank than what there is qualified deal flow.
You are listening to the Property Developer Podcast, your home for tips, ideas and inspiration to help take your developing to the next level. Now here's your host, Justin Getty.
Hello and welcome to episode 50 of the show. Thanks for joining me. How are you doing? How are your projects going? I am well, and I'm pretty excited to reach the 50 episode milestone. So thank you for listening in and making the show worthwhile. I feel like we've covered some really good topics so far, and there is still so much more I want to bring to you. So stay tuned for the next 50 shows. So today we are going to be talking finance with past guest Matthew Royal. He is going to give us a roundup of the current lending landscape and what is happening with development finance. We'll get to that in a moment. I don't have anything to report with my projects. We are still waiting to hear back from council about one project going to advertising and for their feedback on the scheme for my other project. So it's really just a holding pattern for now. You may recall in episode 48 where I spoke with Andy Hoyne about how to get 200 people lining up to buy stock in your next development project, that we offered a copy of Andy's beautiful book, The Place Economy, valued at $200, to anyone who could suggest a great case study of a project that had made a big difference in their local community. I did receive a number of examples from listeners, and Andy has selected a winner. So the winner is, drumroll please, Larry Lee, who sent in a great development project in Auckland, New Zealand called Hobsonville Point. It is a significant redevelopment of an old Air Force base that is being slowly developed to provide more than 4,500 new homes of different types and price points. It was a great case study and it looks really good. And I will put a link to the project's website, which is hobsonvillepoint.co.nz, in the show notes if you want to have a look at it. So congratulations, Larry. Enjoy the book, and thanks again to all the people who sent in suggestions. Just quickly before we move on with the show, if you are interested in learning how to develop property safely and profitably, then email me, justin@propertydeveloperpodcast.com, to find out about the mentoring program that is available to listeners of the show. Okay, on to today's guest, finance expert Matthew Royal, who is also a past guest of the show. He featured in episode 28. In that episode, we talked about building up a pipeline of works and how banks assess risk, amongst other things. Matthew has a long association with development finance, and I wanted to speak with him about the current lending landscape and what developers are facing with getting finance for their projects, as a lot has changed since our last chat. In this conversation, we discuss what's happening with the banks, how developers are still obtaining development funding, and some tips on how to manage the current credit conditions. So let's hear from Matthew. For those listeners who didn't hear our last conversation, which was about a year ago, can you just give us a quick background on yourself and what you do?
Yeah, background, property finance, a little bit of project marketing, which is where I started off my career, doing some investment sales. Then did some retail mortgages as a brokerage, in a brokerage capacity, working in that same business. Did a little bit of acquisition work as they transitioned into doing more of their own projects. Then progressively over the years, I got more and more interested in finance. Started my own finance brokerage business, and then progressively that morphed into me doing some more of my own real estate investments and probably trading in options on land and putting sites together. And then GFC came along, decided that I should start a family and go and work for a bank. Started in property finance initially at MFS, and then worked in property finance at Bankwest in the property finance unit there. And for the last 7 years, I've been with DFP. Essentially, DFP and the group, we're in debt capital advisory. We advise SME property developers to large privately held developers to institutional developers, how to structure their debt across their portfolio to achieve various outcomes at a group level and obviously at an individual project level as well, up and down the capital structure from land bank debt to residual stock to corporate loan notes, mezzanine finance, core construction debt, senior debt, investment loans. So we've been going in that about 7 years. We've got an AFSL, wholesale AFSL, which we're progressively building. The funds under management on that business still relatively small, but we've got some investments under our belt now, which is good, and looking to expand upon that significantly over the next 12 months.
Well, development finance and finance in general is always a topic of interest to developers, but I would say certainly in the last 6 months in Australia, it's gotten particularly interesting and even more of a focus for developers out there. Can you just give us a quick snapshot of the current lending market and what you're seeing, what you're hearing, and what you're feeling?
Yeah, sure. Look, essentially, it's no secret that the banks are currently really only supporting their existing top-tier clients, largely just recycling the same amount of capital that they have to deploy into construction finance into the same borrower pool. In other words, when a project finishes for a top-tier client, they're happy to recycle that same amount of debt into their next project, into whatever part of the pipeline that is. Certainly they're more conservative in terms of their lending guidelines than they were at the peak of the credit cycle, which is quite some time ago now. Non-bank lenders have come in as a result. They're attracted by a big capital gap that's been left behind by the banks. All sorts of non-bank lenders, from large institutional superannuation funds offshore, being managed by various mortgage managers here in Australia, to mortgage trusts local, to high net worths, hedge funds operating out of Singapore and Hong Kong, international banks to some extent are here, probably not like they were during the last deteriorated part of the credit cycle, but certainly there are some significant investment banks that are doing larger facility limits of circa 60 mil north. There is a lot of non-bank capital looking to find opportunity. In fact, there's probably more capital in non-bank than what there is qualified deal flow. So it's relatively competitive for senior debt, mezz, equity at the moment as a result of all that capital. The movement and the momentum in the whole industry has slowed, which is one of the reasons why there's not enough deal flow in the market. Pre-sales are slow on the way in because sales rates are tough. Settlement rates are slow on the way out. So you've got elongation happening for property developers at both ends of the spectrum, both trying to get a project out of the ground and getting their capital and their profit out on the other end, with their existing banks putting a squeeze on credit supply. So it's interesting times at the moment.
And so is that a sign of market weakness or because of some structural changes like the availability of credit?
Yeah, it's a bit of both. Certainly some markets where high-density construction finance has traditionally been written are the markets where there's been a bit of oversupply, which is obviously just being naturally corrected at the moment. That oversupply is partly just purely too much stock coming into the market, as well as investors predominantly having difficulty accessing loans, especially on an interest-only basis. I think that's the main thing of late that's really slowed up the industry is credit growth into investment-only loans has shrunk dramatically. And there may be buyers out there, but the feedback I'm getting from my clients is that they can't convert them into a sale because there is concern they won't be able to get finance, or in fact that they can't get a pre-approval for finance, which is somewhat frustrating. So that's causing them obviously to look at reconfiguring the mix in their projects from largely investor grade stock, homogenous, 1 and 2 beds, to looking more at marketing and finding ways to facilitate sales through first home buyers, and reconfiguring the mix from largely 1s and 2s to, in many cases, bigger, more owner-occupied driven stock. So it's a bit of a combination from macro-prudential pressure coming from APRA and from the government, obviously, through to just pure fundamentals in some markets being deteriorated. But that's probably all fairly interlinked with each other.
And then what impact is that having on developers in terms of funding, in terms of approaching majors or acquiring land, structuring their projects? What impact is that having, and what advice are you giving your clients?
Well, certainly it's challenging at the moment. If you're new to bank at the moment, as if you with a major bank, it's extremely difficult to obtain finance almost on any terms if you're pure new to bank. On that basis, we have not written a senior bank loan with a major bank for probably the last 9 months. So just about all of the new to bank lending we're doing at the moment is with private lenders, non-banks, which are having to be more flexible on pre-sales. The larger investment banks that are operating here in Australia are having to accept the fact that the developer will be looking to hold residual stock at the end. It's just a reality across their portfolio. So they're having to be flexible with looking at now sensitizing pre-sales rates to assume that the developer is going to be able to access residual stock facilities at various LVRs and set up their pre-sale hurdles to suit based upon, obviously, the individual scenario. Certainly residual stock loans is something we're seeing a lot more of. We're writing a lot more of them, advising our clients now on that as more of a matter of our daily business. And there is a lot of capital that is happy to, a lot of lenders that are happy to lend capital in that space. So that's partly keeping the industry going at the moment, both on the working capital side for property developers, as well as getting projects out of the ground, because there's generally an acceptance on larger projects, even smaller projects, that the pre-sales are going to be difficult to obtain within a reasonable time frame if we're talking about 100% debt cover. So we're seeing probably 50 to 60% to 80%, depending upon what makes sense in the local market, being able to be achieved, which then means you're back to maybe a 50 or 60% residual LVR on completion, which is where a residual stock facility will come in and obviously refinance that debt out in lieu of pre-sales. And that's just the reality at the moment.
And so that sanitisation, I think, did you call it, for your off-the-plan sales, is that returning back to more historic levels from the high rates that we've had over time, or is it dropping back beyond that?
Oh, look, I think the sales rate, the pre-sale hurdles, that's what you're referring to. What are the traditional or historical pre-sale levels?
Obviously we're coming off a pretty hot period of 3 to 5 years where everything was selling and selling quickly and selling at good prices to something that we might be moving back to a more balanced market that may be at more historic rates, or are we sort of lower than that?
I think at the moment the reality is for the bank, so there's 2 tiers of financing. There's obviously the bank, and then there's non-bank. Bank at the moment, realistically, APRA is encouraging strongly the banks to adopt uniform lending standards as far as pre-sales are concerned, and the quality of those sales as well. the qualifying criteria now for a pre-sale is much more stringent in terms of the overall composition of the sales. On that basis, it doesn't really matter what market you're in, how strong it is, or how strong it is. There is a requirement that the banks have to be adopting no less than 100% of debt cover. And that's just, it doesn't even matter at what LVR, who you are as a developer, generally speaking, what market you're in. That's just the lending standards that are being demanded at the moment. Non-bank is always case by case. I think non-bank lenders are willing to be more flexible and have a level of sophistication and understanding of markets where they can adopt, and also pressure on them to get money out the door, to be as flexible as they can in order to get a deal done, to get a loan away. There's always going to be limits to that level of flexibility, and sometimes that'll come down to, in most often, the size of the facility. There's an ability for us to do no pre-sales in strong markets, major metro markets, for smaller facilities, probably sub $10 million. Once we get over $10 million, the number of options that are out there for no pre-sales starts thinning out fairly quickly. But as a general rule, we might be at 50% of debt cover for a non-bank lender. Over $10 million would be a rough sort of guideline, and that would be probably historically where we would have seen things in a normal balanced market. I think other than APRA putting pressure on the majors at the moment to be uniformly consistent with risk hurdles and lending standards, what will drive the banks to come back into the market is when the sales rates will return to where they were. It just makes sense that if stock is selling quickly, there's less market risk. Ultimately, the risk from a lending perspective is always going to be on sensitising the value of the sales on completion and how quickly you can sell them. The liquidity of the stock is ultimately what they're looking for. So markets where, projects in Sydney were selling out on a weekend on launch, well, those days are largely over and have been for some time. In those markets, you'll see probably the banks coming back to 60, 70% pre-sales debt cover. But at the moment, even if that was there at the moment, I would suggest that APRA is still going to have them under significant pressure to be at no less than 100% debt cover. But ultimately, the take-home message is market fundamentals will drive sales rate, and sales rate will drive the debt cover guidelines from the banks in a normal market.
All right, a couple of questions for you. When do you see sales rates improving, or do you have a view on that? And then the other one is the market fundamentals, your view on those.
Yeah, look, I think there's always markets within markets. I think at the moment, to address market fundamentals, the current level of credit supply is having a big impact on the market. The credit supply into, for example, the investment stock is extremely limited, especially on an interest-only basis. So I think projects that are heavily focused towards investment sales will struggle significantly, which is the reason why we're seeing developers reposition their stock and reconfigure the mix into more owner-occupied stock, which are looking at downsizes that obviously more cash buyers or are coming into a sale with limited debt. And they're often coming out of a bigger house in established locations where there's been capital appreciation and there's reasonable amount of equity. Projects which are geared towards retirees generally speaking, in most markets are going quite well. The sales rates are very strong. Manufactured housing estates, for example, we're advising and financing a number of those at the moment in various locations, and the sales rates on those projects are very strong, and so are the competing projects. So there's two examples of two different markets: the investment sales and downsizers, retirees. They're performing very differently at the moment. Markets like Newcastle, Wollongong, Port Macquarie, and various Geelong is perhaps another one, which is obviously more related to Melbourne. The markets where there is affordability, where there's been significant spend on infrastructure to improve access, where the demographic is retirees that are moving towards established, affordable locations. I think they're the markets that are doing quite well. The same markets are doing well for an affordability, pure affordability as well. We're seeing big interstate migration into Brisbane at the moment, where the employment base is relatively sound, the cost of living is significantly less, the quality of living is significantly better, and it's encouraging people out of Sydney especially to look to markets where there is simply a better quality of life and a lower cost of living, i.e. Much less debt. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question. So look, realistically, there's so many markets to talk about. I think to answer maybe just very broadly, Sydney, I think it's well documented that Sydney's certainly reached its peak and has probably had a number of consistent quarters of negative growth now, where the investment story has deteriorated significantly, which is being, which then just becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy after that. I think the outer regions of Sydney on an affordable price point on a rail line will probably continue to do reasonably well. I think Brisbane in 18 months and moving forward, if you've got stock settling out in 18 months' time and you can buy sites well at the moment in well-located areas, makes sense. I think the middle ring of Brisbane to outer ring of Brisbane makes sense because of the population growth that's looking for affordability and still close to amenity and transport. I think Melbourne, outer ring of Melbourne, land subs are still doing exceedingly well because there's still an affordable price point that can be met in Melbourne. Migration levels are still strong into Melbourne. I think the apartment market in Melbourne, generally speaking, will be focused more on downsizes, larger stock, much more focused on 3 bedrooms, and just a better quality design, and probably developers that can respond to owner-occupiers' more individual demands for design and for fixtures and finishes, and some level of alterations to the layout potentially as well could do quite well. Yeah.
Okay, and so what is tripping developers up at the moment from a finance perspective?
That's a big question. I think the property developers at the moment are probably struggling with as much their marketing strategy and the positioning of their stock and the level of pre-sales that they need from their banks and the level of equity that they need to tip in for them to and their finance and also their upfront marketing costs are so significant that they are struggling to get a project to work and for it to be viable. they're probably not looking enough at options that are available in the non-bank space, where there are so many options now in the non-bank space at all levels of loan amounts, for them to probably really understand what are the different financing options that are out there for them that make sense, both on a level of pre-sales that they need to be able to get away, the amount of residual stock debt that is available for them on completion to be able to hold some stock in the absence of upfront sales, or even the achievement of pre-sales during the course of construction. So they've really got to, I think, develop a much better understanding of the positioning of the project, the marketing and sales strategy that sits within the development strategy overall, the financing strategy as it relates to the marketing and the sales strategy, which obviously relates to the configuration and the mix that's within the project. So they've probably just got to take a look at the overall development strategy and figure out which one of their projects are most viable and how do I go about delivering a project on a highest and best use and a highest and best strategy by coordinating all of those things together. And the developers that are still doing reasonably well. So I don't think it's just a financing strategy that's really got to be looked at. I think it's encompassing all the various things together.
And is that because people or developers are just looking at funding through the lens of price? That's sort of holding them back from exploring some of these other options?
Yeah, look, potentially. Look, we do get some clients and some inquiry that is caught up on price. And perhaps, they equate price to their level of, well, number one, they don't want to pay no one wants to pay any more than what they have to. But ultimately, they've got they've got to be realistic with respect to the pricing that's in the market at the moment. Unfortunately, some people are early in the process of obtaining finance, and they're still stuck on where the banks were 18 months to 2 years ago, and they might not have been out seeking finance for some time. The process then that they've got to go through to realistically come to terms with where the banks are actually at is sometimes a 6-month application process, which can be quite frustrating with their existing bank or other banks. Eventually they get to a point where they realise that they're not going to be able to do it through the banks, and then they obviously have to go into the non-bank space and then come to terms with the various pricing models that are in the market. And sometimes it can be difficult for them to come to terms with that. That is a challenge, and also that the level of pre-sales that still need to be met in some cases with non-bank lenders, depending upon what level of price that they're after. So I'm not sure if that answers your question very well, but
yeah, it does.
But yeah.
And then what about people who are not getting funding?
Not getting funding.
Well, are there projects or
ultimately, ultimately, any viable project can be virtually any viable project where the fundamentals are sound can be financed. It ultimately comes down to the overall cost of the sales that have to be met and the overall cost of the finance. But a viable project, in the vast majority of cases, should be financed and can be financed. It pretty much comes down to viability, and obviously then the client's expectations with what they'll accept with respect to pricing and the level of risk hurdles that they need to meet.
Okay. Well, I wanted to ask your view on the impact that these changes in lending standards will be having on the bank's bottom line, because their profits are going to drop, and also government revenue taking in the form of stamp duty and all the other various taxes is going to drop. So do you see this as a short-term cyclical change, or are these standards going to be around for 3, 4, 5 years, or do you see light on the horizon in 12, 18 months, 2 years?
Yeah, well, look, everything's at the moment we're going through a rationing of credit supply, which is a normal part of the overall cycle. Everything's cyclical, and at the moment we're just going through a period of deteriorated credit, which will limit supply into the near future, and population growth being one of the most important indicators of likelihood of capital improvement and increases in demand are all forecasted to keep going north. I think at 11 o'clock tonight we're apparently hitting 25 million people in Australia, which is decades ahead of what was forecast to be only 10, 15 years ago. I think we're now going to be sitting at a migration growth of 190,000 people that's going to be capped per annum as far as immigration is concerned. I think population growth, natural population growth, is continuing to put pressure on the major cities, and I can't see that sort of diminishing anytime soon. So with credit growth, we're going to see decreased supply, with decreased supply, with increased population growth, essentially we'll see a shortage of stock come into the market, probably in circa 18 months' time, which will put significant pressure on prices in terms of then we'll see escalating prices and sales rates return, which then will mean that will encourage new credit growth because borrowers will be more credit worthy with less risk, and around we go again. That's what I believe will happen. And if it's not 18 months, then it's going to be only a certain number of further point in time before it happens. It can't not happen unless population growth slows or starts to become negative. Then that process will just play out.
Well, the federal government can't afford to let Australia's population growth slide because we've got all these baby boomers who are going to be moving from taxpayers to tax consumers or public spending consumers as they move into their older age and start using all the hospital and other pension systems. Someone's got to pay for those services. Absolutely.
Well, I think we're probably lucky in that a lot of the wealth that's contained in the property market is skewed towards probably a reasonable number of those aging baby boomers, and as they downsize and as they obviously are going to be spending their super, or being that percentage of the population that's not going to be on the pension or on welfare, there's a reasonable amount of wealth that's going to be unlocked. And is being unlocked by those people obviously starting to draw on super and taking the capital growth that's in their portfolio and spending it on travel and spending it on downsizing and new construction as they're buying into retirement villages and manufactured housing estates and apartments generally. I've lived in apartment buildings before, and more owner-occupied style apartment buildings, and I would say that the average age of people in those apartment buildings would have been probably 55, and that's potentially for those wealthy self-funded retirees that are downsizing may also help stimulate demand, which is what we're seeing at the moment in the apartment projects that are being successful. There's a healthy mix of design that's encouraging depth of market, but both some investment grade, some first home buyer, but much more towards that downsizer market. So hopefully there's going to be some of that transfer of wealth as a result of the baby boomers with money coming into the market before too long.
All right, well, I know that you've got somewhere you need to get to. So, what's your top tip for developers out there to help them take their developing to the next level?
Look, I think, from a financing perspective, uh, there there is such a plethora of non-bank capital in the market at the moment, to the point where we have a capital partners list in the business of about 200 different capital providers, all with about 3 or 4 or more products of their own. So the number of products that are out there is, there's several hundred products that can be deployed into a developer's portfolio to help free up equity, to finance construction, to provide working capital, to take on residual debt on completion of a project in lieu of pre-sales, finance projects with no pre-sales, from MES to pref equity to corporate equity, is really just obviously it's some self-promotion here, but it doesn't change the fact that it's true, is speak to some advisors like us that can actually advise them not only on an individual project and an individual part of the capital structure of an individual project, but all the various parts of the capital structure of each project and the phase of each project, whether it be land settlement through to residual stock, and then assess that on a group basis. So there might be 3 or 4 or more projects, that same level of sophistication and flexibility can be applied across the whole group. And that's where people, developers that have got some equity, have got viable projects, can still deliver projects into the market. And that's what I would encourage more developers to do. And just take on the fact that cost of debt in non-bank is simply more. But ultimately it comes down to, does a developer want to be able to complete on their pipeline and do 5 or 6 projects in the next 2 years and have a higher cost of debt? Or do they want to do 1 or 2 projects and have a cheaper cost of debt? Ultimately, for a viable project, the cost of debt, even in non-bank, is only, it's relatively minor in the grand scheme of the overall profit and returns. So it's probably just, my main tip would be just to get a bit smarter about that.
And so is it also a case of factoring in a slightly higher cost of finance and also some extra time to getting that in place at the start?
Well, I think certainly in relation to timing, we can, in non-bank, the level of responsiveness is very fast. The level of the timeframes to get either a land bank facility approved or construction debt is probably a couple of weeks at the most. So it's not really so much, the earlier that they get the approvals in place, the better, obviously. But the process can play out fairly quickly. From a cost of finance perspective, it's ultimately going to be higher than where the banks are at the moment. And it's, if you're looking at circa 65 on comp for a decent project in a decent location, and you're at 50% debt cover, the cost of debt on a first mortgage basis will be probably on average around 11%. And fees will be sitting around 1.5% as an establishment fee. If a project is still showing reasonably strong returns and sound returns after that, then the project can still be completed, profit can still be made, and they can continue to move forward. Versus, trying to get it done through a bank at all up 6% and a 1% establishment fee, and potentially take 6 months to get a finance approval in place, if at all. So it's really just up to the developer to do their numbers and figure out if it's worth it for themselves.
All right. Well, I'm conscious of your time, so we'll have to leave it there. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us with a finance update. Where can people find out more about you or about DFP, Matthew?
Yeah, so look, our website is dfpartners.com.au, or my email address is mroyal@dfpartners.com.au.
All right. Thanks for speaking with me again today, Matthew. Hope we can have another chat about finance at some stage in the near future and be talking about better lending conditions.
Good stuff. Thanks, Justin. Good to chat with you.
Okay, there you go. An update on how things are looking out there in funding land. It certainly sounds like things have turned in terms of availability of credit, and many developers are looking at alternatives to simple senior debt funding from the banks. Here are a couple of things I took away from my chat with Matthew. 1. Banks aren't lending to new clients. So, if you don't have an existing relationship with a major bank, it seems you may have trouble securing a loan with them. This has meant that many developers are exploring alternative funding options and residual stock loans, which may come at a higher cost than what they had originally planned for in their feasibilities. So my advice is to start discovering what options and costs you may need to include in your next project feasibility. 2. Look at your marketing, sales and finance strategies. With the current lending landscape, how are you going to tackle the existing conditions? Do you need to review how you are planning on marketing your properties? Is your sales campaign right for where the market is headed? And how accurate is your funding strategy? As the market moves, it's prudent to monitor and update your project plan. 3. Seek early input from your trusted advisors. As the funding sands seem to be frequently shifting, it would be wise to speak with your advisors about what's happening, how your project may be viewed by lenders, and how you plan on securing funding to get your project delivered. Early and ongoing discussions can avoid nasty surprises later, which may slow down your development and eat into your bottom line. Alright, we are almost done for another episode. If you enjoyed that chat with Matthew Royal, then I suggest going back to our past discussion in episode 28 and listen out for the many tips and ideas that Matthew had on how to grow your development business, including this gem of advice, which is still highly relevant today.
But from a banker's perspective, when you see the developer identifying that risk, quantifying the risk, and then attaching a budget within the funding structure to further reduce that risk, it's gold.
There is plenty of other great tips in that episode, so go back and take a listen. And if you are interested in learning how to develop property, then please send me an email, justin@propertydeveloperpodcast.com, find out more. Remember, all the past episodes of the show can be found at www.propertydeveloperpodcast.com. So until next time, may all your funding applications be approved.
You've been listening to the Property Developer Podcast. Tune in next time for more tips, ideas and inspiration to take your developing to the next level. For more developing love, make sure to visit propertydeveloperpodcast.com.